The year is 48 CE. Somewhere beneath the streets of Rome, in the imperial archives, a worker raises his chisel to a stone tomb. His task is mundane, carving off names that the empire has ordered erased. But this particular name carries weight. Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, once ruled from the seat beside Emperor Claudius himself. Now, her name is being chiseled away from the final resting place of a man who served her, as if she never existed at all. The empire is rewriting her from history. But the reason for her erasure wasn't some grand political conspiracy or a failed assassination plot. It was far simpler and far more grotesque. Messalina had committed the unforgivable sin of female independence, of sexual autonomy, and Rome had transformed her disappearance into theater. Not the theater of the mind, but the theater of the arena, where entertainment and execution became indistinguishable. This is the story Rome tried to bury. How an empire turned the bodies of women into scripts, how degradation became art, and how a system of absolute control wrapped itself in the language of justice and spectacle. What we're about to explore is not simply the history of execution. It's the archaeology of a society that understood something modern civilization still grapples with, that the power to humiliate is the ultimate power, and that public cruelty, orchestrated correctly, can bind an entire population in shared complicity. From the earliest centuries of Rome, the empire had established a particular system for managing danger. Criminals didn't simply disappear into dungeons. They were transformed into symbols, into cautionary tales given flesh. The arena wasn't just a place of death. It was a stage where the state performed its authority. But for women, especially women who violated sexual codes, this performance took on a particularly elaborate and vicious character. The Roman legal code, crystallized in the Lex Julia de Adulterius passed by Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE, didn't merely criminalize adultery. It criminalized female sexuality itself. A woman caught in an affair wasn't simply divorced. She was reclassified. Her legal status transformed overnight into something closer to a prostitute, a meretrix, a marked woman stripped of all social standing and all possibility of recovery. Her dowry was forfeit. Her right to remarry was gone. Her inheritance rights evaporated. But this legal death was only the prelude. What made Rome's system unique was its understanding that legal punishment wasn't enough. Shame had to be public. The woman's body had to be displayed. Her humiliation had to be witnessed. And her degradation had to be choreographed in such a way that it seemed inevitable, even theatrical. This wasn't accidental cruelty. This was policy. This was pedagogy. Families were expected to attend these spectacles with their children. Mothers would point out the specific tortures being inflicted and explain to their daughters exactly what awaited a woman who strayed from approved pathways. Fathers would describe the screams as lessons in female obedience. The message was clear. Your body belongs to the state, and if you transgress, your body becomes the state's property to dispose of as it sees fit. The most notorious example of this system in action was Valeria Messalina herself. She wasn't simply accused of adultery. According to the accounts that have survived, accounts written by men, shaped by political enemies, but revealing nonetheless, she had taken lovers with such openness, such apparent disregard for her position, that the scandal threatened to topple the emperor himself. The rumors spoke of midnight competitions in brothels, of contests between Messalina and Rome's most celebrated prostitutes, of sexual conquests that seemed to deliberately mock the institution of marriage and imperial authority itself. Whether these accounts were entirely true matters less than the fact that Rome believed them or wanted to believe them. Belief itself was the weapon. a woman powerful enough to affect state policy, wealthy enough to act without restriction, and sexually autonomous enough to defy her husband. She represented a kind of threat that transcended the personal. She represented a crack in the entire system of control. The circumstances of her fall were politically convenient. Messalina had allegedly entered into a secret marriage with a senator named Gaius Silius while Claudius was away. Whether this was genuine conspiracy or political theater orchestrated by Claudius's advisor Narcissus remains unclear even to modern historians. But clarity didn't matter. The accusation was enough. Claudius was informed, and in a panic that seemed almost performative, he rushed back to Rome. What happened next demonstrates how completely the machinery of the state could be mobilized against a single woman. She was arrested, her alleged lover was executed, and then came the spectacle. The records suggest that Messalina was offered the option of honorable suicide, a privilege granted to women of her rank. Some sources claim she was taken to the gardens of Lucullus, gardens she had coveted and seized during her years of power, and there she was killed by the Praetorian Guard. But the execution itself was almost secondary to what mattered: the symbolic death, the erasure, the complete dissolution of her existence from the apparatus of state memory. Coins bearing her image were defaced. Her name was chiseled from monuments. The empire had perfected a system where a woman could be unmade not just through death, but through systematic forgetting. Yet Messalina's case was unusual only in its speed and its focus on a woman of the highest rank. The same machinery operated continuously against lower-born women who violated sexual codes. And here, the spectacle took on an even more grotesque character. Rather than quiet assassination, there was the arena. Rather than rapid erasure, there was prolonged display. The system that took shape across the 1st and 2nd centuries of the empire developed a category of execution specifically designed to combine sexual humiliation with violent death, what we might call erotic damnatio, condemnation to beasts, but with a particular emphasis on the sexual dimension of the crime, the sexual character of the humiliation, and the sexual nature of the entertainment. These executions weren't spontaneous. They were meticulously planned theatrical productions. The poet Martial, who attended and documented these events in his work called the Liber Spectacularum, described in detail how condemned criminals were forced to reenact mythological scenes that had sexual dimensions. A woman condemned for adultery might be cast as Pasiphae, the mythological queen who, cursed by the gods, fell in love with a white bull and bore the Minotaur. In the arena, she would be dressed in clothing designed to evoke a cow, covered in animal hide, and positioned before a trained bull. What happened next was meant to reenact the myth in literal fashion. Martial recorded one such spectacle with an almost casual brutality. Believe that Pasiphae was mated to the Dictaean bull. We have seen it. The old legend has won credence. The phrasing is instructive. The crowd was meant to believe this was happening. Whether the bestiality was genuine, whether the bull was actually trained for such purposes, whether the woman survived the initial encounter or was killed quickly, these details mattered less than the belief created in the spectators' minds that they were witnessing the literal reenactment of sexual transgression, culminating in death. Other condemned women were cast as Europa, as the Danaids, as characters from the erotic narratives of Apuleius's Metamorphoses. In each case, the myth provided a script, the arena provided a stage, and the woman's body provided the material for the performance. The theater critic would recognize the structure immediately: setup, middle, and resolution. But here, the resolution was death, and the audience's participation was mandatory. Families came with food. Children were brought as moral lessons. The spectacle was as much about what the crime was supposed to mean, about power, about control, about the limits of female autonomy, as about the crime itself. What made these executions distinct from simple murder was their theatrical architecture. The condemned women weren't simply killed, they were transformed into characters, into symbols, into warnings made flesh. The system functioned as a kind of violent pedagogy. Roman law had already stripped these women of legal standing. The arena was where that legal death was made visible, where it was monumentalized, where it was burned into the consciousness of everyone who witnessed it. And the sexual character of the humiliation was entirely deliberate. It wasn't incidental that the myths chosen often involved sexual transgression. It was central to the message. The crime, adultery, promiscuity, sexual autonomy, sometimes simply being born female in the wrong family, became inseparable from the punishment. The woman's body was the text. Her humiliation was the sermon. Her death was the moral. Yet the arena reserved its most elaborate productions for a different category of women altogether, the Vestal virgins. These women represented something unique in Roman society. Selected as young as 6 years old from patrician families, they served for 30 years in a quasi-religious role, maintaining the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta. They were simultaneously venerated and imprisoned. They received honors and privileges, but at the cost of complete sexual renunciation and near-total restriction of movement. They lived in the Atrium Vestae, essentially a compound adjacent to the Forum, under the constant observation of the chief priest and each other. Their virginity wasn't simply personal, it was state property. The integrity of their bodies was the integrity of Rome itself. Any breach of chastity was incestum, not merely adultery, but a kind of religious treason. When a Vestal virgin was suspected of breaking her vow, the investigation that followed was systematic and relentless. The accused woman would be questioned repeatedly, obsessively. Every relationship, every friendship, every moment of private time would be examined for evidence of transgression. Other Vestals would be questioned about her, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mutual surveillance within the house itself. The psychological machinery was as important as any judicial machinery. The mere accusation could destroy. Several prominent cases were eventually recognized as politically motivated. Enemies of a Vestal's family would manufacture evidence or coach slaves to provide false testimony to damage their rivals. But by the time these fabrications were identified, the damage was already done. If found guilty, the Vestal Virgin faced a punishment unique in Roman law. Because she was sacred, her blood could not be shed by human hands. This constraint created a grotesque legal puzzle. The empire wanted her dead, but it needed to maintain the fiction that it wasn't directly responsible for her death. The solution was a punishment so calculated in its methodology, so elaborate in its preservation of legal technicality, that it makes the casual brutality of other Roman executions seem almost merciful by comparison. She would be taken to a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of Evil, near the Colline Gate, beyond the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. There, an underground chamber had been prepared. Small, barely large enough for a person to stand or lie down, this subterranean cell was fitted with minimal provisions: a bed, a lamp, a small amount of bread, water, milk, and oil. Enough to survive a few days. Not enough to survive indefinitely. The condemned Vestal would be led in procession through the streets of Rome. She would be dressed in her sacred vestments for the last time. She would be placed in a closed litter, a covered sedan chair, because the Romans maintained that she shouldn't be seen. This detail is crucial to understanding the system. Rome wanted the spectacle of her punishment to exist in the minds of citizens, even as it maintained that it wasn't directly creating that spectacle. The procession would move slowly through the forum, accompanied by magistrates and priests. Citizens would line the streets. Many would weep. The psychological impact was deliberate. Everyone understood what was happening, but everyone also understood that officially nothing wrong was being done. The Vestal was simply being led to a chamber where she would be given provisions. If she died, it was because the gods decided it, not because Rome had killed her. The legal fiction was maintained even as the reality was transparent to everyone. At the execution site, the final ceremony would unfold. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, would perform a ritual. He would raise his hands to heaven and utter a secret prayer that no one else was permitted to hear. Then the condemned Vestal would be led down a ladder into the underground chamber. The ladder would be drawn up. The chamber would be sealed. Earth would be piled over the entrance until the ground was level with the surrounding surface. And then the city would move on. The woman would remain below, in darkness, with her provisions that would run out in days, her lamp that would eventually consume all its oil, and the knowledge that she was being left to die slowly, alone, while Rome continued above her. One historical record mentions a Vestal virgin named Oculata, who survived underground for 18 days before the silence finally came. Another source describes the broken pottery that lined some of these chambers, shards placed deliberately so that if the prisoner tried to dig her way out, she would lacerate her hands. The chambers sometimes had small openings that allowed sounds to carry up to ground level. Romans would bring their children to listen to the sounds of a dying woman, calling it a religious education. The empire had transformed the space beneath the city into a kind of extended torture chamber where time itself became the instrument of execution. The frequency of these accusations and executions was not uniform. They clustered around periods of political instability or military crisis. When Rome suffered defeats or when emperors felt their power threatened, accusations against Vestals would spike dramatically. The women became convenient scapegoats. If the empire had suffered military defeats, the cause was divine displeasure, and divine displeasure could be explained by a breach of sacred duty, a Vestal's alleged transgression. In 216 BCE, the year Rome suffered its catastrophic defeat at Cannae during the Second Punic War, 3 Vestals were accused of breaking their vows and executed. The timing was almost perfectly inverse to military fortune. The worse Rome's military situation, the more likely it became that a Vestal would be accused and executed. The system functioned as both sacrifice and distraction, a way for the state to demonstrate piety and simultaneously to deflect blame for its own failures. The reign of Emperor Domitian saw a particularly vicious series of accusations. Domitian, known to history as paranoid and vindictive, used investigations into Vestal virgins as a mechanism of political control. The mere suggestion that a senator's relative might face investigation was sufficient to ensure political compliance. Accusations could be fabricated or exaggerated with near impunity. The chief Vestal Cornelia was executed on charges that even contemporary observers recognized as fabricated. According to Pliny the Younger, who witnessed her execution, she maintained her innocence throughout the process. As she was being led to the underground chamber, she cried out that Caesar should know that his victories proved the Vestals had performed the sacred rites correctly. Her words fell on deaf ears. She was sealed underground just the same. What these cases make clear is that the punishment of Vestal virgins wasn't primarily about justice or even about religious transgression. It was about control. It was a demonstration of power so complete, so elaborate in its methodology, that it implicated the entire population in the punishment. Citizens were forced to witness the process. They were forced to know what was happening. They were forced to maintain the legal fiction even as they knew the truth. The psychological impact rippled through all of society. If even the most sacred women in Rome, women specifically chosen for their virtue and surrounded by every possible protection, could be accused and executed based on potentially fabricated evidence, then no woman was safe. No one was truly secure. The system created a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and fear that extended far beyond the atrium vestae. The arena executions of lower-born women operated within this same atmosphere, but with even greater elaborateness. These women didn't have the sacred status of Vestals. They couldn't be punished through burial and absence. Instead, they became the subjects of the arena's most grotesque productions. Historical sources record the execution of female Christians alongside female criminals and women of lower social rank. Perpetua and Felicitas, two Christian women executed in Carthage in 203 CE, were subjected to animal attack, but the specific nature of how female victims were treated differs from records of male executions. When male victims were exposed to wild beasts, the accounts typically describe the animal's attack with clinical brutality. When female victims were treated similarly, the descriptions take on an additional dimension. The sources emphasize the removal of clothing, the public nudity, the sexual dimension of the humiliation. Perpetua's account, preserved in a diary written by the martyr herself, describes how she and Felicitas were to be brought out to face a wild cow. The choice of animal is itself significant. It's gendered, echoing the Pasiphae myth. But what happened next reveals the texture of how the Roman system actually functioned. When the spectators realized what was being planned, that these women were to be exposed nude to the beast, the crowd itself became uncomfortable. The organizers had miscalculated. The spectacle had crossed some boundary into a territory that even Rome's bloodthirsty crowds found excessive. The women were therefore allowed to wear loose garments. This adjustment doesn't represent mercy or humanity. Rather, it demonstrates that the system was calibrated, deliberately designed to find the exact threshold of what crowds would tolerate. Too much, and you lose your audience. Too little, and the warning isn't strong enough. The spectacle had to be precisely calibrated to maximize psychological impact while maintaining just enough plausible deniability that spectators could convince themselves they were witnessing justice rather than mere cruelty. Emperor Caligula understood this system perfectly. He didn't merely attend arena spectacles. He designed them with meticulous attention to psychological detail. Historical records suggest he would spend weeks planning the choreography of executions, consulting with architects and animal trainers to create new forms of suffering. He invited foreign dignitaries to attend these spectacles, transforming executions into a form of diplomatic theater. The message was clear to any visitor or rival power. This is what Rome does to those who transgress. This is our control. This is our absolute dominance over the bodies and lives of our subjects. Nero pushed this system even further. Beyond arena executions, Nero was known to participate in smaller, more intimate spectacles, where the boundaries between entertainment and execution became almost impossible to discern. He would clothe condemned Christians in animal skins and have them attacked by dogs, not in the grand arena before thousands, but in smaller venues for the entertainment of his immediate circle. The system had become so normalized, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of imperial power, that it could manifest in multiple scales simultaneously. From state-orchestrated arena spectacles to small private entertainments, the same principle operated. The female or marginal body transformed into property, into entertainment, into a tool for demonstrating power. The psychological architecture of this system depended on a particular kind of complicity. Citizens were forced to witness these spectacles. Attendance was essentially mandatory for anyone of significant social standing. By forcing people to watch, by requiring them to be present, by making them implicit in the punishment through their mere presence, the state bound them into the system. You couldn't claim innocence. You had watched. You had been there. You had participated, at minimum through your silence and your presence. The effect was to create a shared responsibility, a collective guilt that bonded the population to the regime even as it horrified them. You were implicated. You couldn't escape. And that implication, that complicity, was the point. What made these executions specifically erotic in character wasn't simply that they involved sexual transgression or sexual humiliation, though they did. It was that the sexual dimension was weaponized. The crime itself, adultery, promiscuity, deviation from prescribed female sexuality, became inseparable from the punishment. The woman's body, already criminalized through the legal code, became literally inscribed as criminal through the spectacle. The sexual humiliation wasn't separate from the execution. It was the execution. To watch a woman's body being displayed, humiliated, and destroyed became entertainment precisely because it confirmed and reinforced the system's control over female sexuality itself. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't some distant atrocity disconnected from how power operates. The system Rome perfected, using the threat of sexual humiliation as a tool of control, weaponizing spectacle to bind populations in complicity, transforming bodies into texts through which state power performs itself. These mechanisms persist in the modern world in various forms and scales. Rome understood something that modern societies are still grappling with, that the power to humiliate is political power, that public degradation is a tool of governance, that making spectacle out of suffering doesn't merely entertain, it educates, it normalizes, it binds the audience into the logic of domination. The system that Rome created, with its Vestal virgins slowly suffocating in underground chambers, with its arena spectacles where female criminals were transformed into mythological characters and destroyed before crowds, with its legal codes that stripped women of standing before they were physically destroyed. This system depended on a particular technology of power, the technology of making people watch, making people witness, making people understand that they were seeing not entertainment, but warning, not spectacle, but demonstration, not exception, but policy. In the end, what Rome created was a culture where the control of female bodies and female sexuality wasn't an aberration. It was civilizational infrastructure. It was woven into the law, into religious practice, into entertainment, into the very fabric of how power understood and reproduced itself. The women who died, whether silently in underground chambers or publicly in arena spectacles, they died not simply as punishments for particular crimes, they died as demonstrations. They died as warnings. They died as performances of a system's fundamental commitment to absolute control. And the crowds that watched, that were forced to watch, they participated in that system through their presence, through their silence, through their consumption of the spectacle. They became part of the machinery. They became complicit. And that complicity, that binding of the population into the logic of domination through forced spectatorship, that was perhaps Rome's most enduring achievement.